Here to discuss the challenges of globalization and human health, please welcome Joe Almeida, George Barrett, and Mike Milken. Thank you. Hey, Joe. George. Mike. So, it's a connected world, and this is an obvious challenge to everyone in thinking about whether it is the spread of disease, as we saw with the Ebola virus, with emerging threats, whether you have global supply chains, which I know, of course, all of you do or have had in the past, or if it's a question of figuring out intellectual property and figuring out whether you can protect that in a world in which it's very easy to back engineer something and figure out how to steal it. Mike, when we were talking earlier, you talked particularly about the kind of value to society that comes out of healthcare. And I think it would be interesting just to use that as a framing device, if you would.
Well, the idea that if you can save one life, you save the world is obviously an idea, but there's an economic issue that people talk about, how much should I pay, et cetera. And I think we sometimes forget that the major growth in the world for the last 200 years has come from public health and medical research. When you think that average life expectancy on this planet was 31 in 1900, 31 years of age. Today it's well into the low 70s. That's for the whole planet. And in 4 million years of evolution, you extended life by 11 years, and now we've extended life by more than 40 years in just the last 115, 16 years. I think we don't recognize how important it is. And if you thought that the life expectancy in Southeast Asia or South Asia was going to increase by 70% in 2 generations, if you're just an investor, it would have been a great place to invest. And today, I think from our standpoint, one of the great challenges in the world now is really sub-Saharan Africa. UN is projecting in Africa as a whole an increase of 3 billion people in the balance of this century. I don't believe that's going to happen, but you're going to have 1 to 2 billion more people. Mm-hmm. And what happens on this planet, it's going to be heavily related to what the opportunities, what their life is, what meaning. And a lot of this can be attributed straight to medical research, advances, treatment that's occurred. I mean, Uganda, median age is 15. And so with a 98% probability of not passing AIDS to your children in a continent that has 2/3 of the people, it's going to be a tremendous challenge for the world to create those opportunities for them. But I think started out, we just think how unbelievable is that new drug or a new therapy can save a life. But it's created the world as we know it.
Mm-hmm. Joe, and we're seeing obviously a complete transformation of the health status of many in the developing world, where chronic diseases that we associated with the West are now very common in many developing countries. We've seen, obviously, growth of cancer and heart disease and diabetes, in particular in China, but also kidney disease. And these are areas that you work with. As you see it, and part of the problem of the borderless world is we've exported a lot of our old, rich people's diseases to them in many cases.
Yeah, we did, and but we cannot export enough and fast enough the treatment and potentially the alleviation of pain and cure. You have chronic disease today. Think about kidney, about 6 million people in the world suffering from some degree of kidney failure. And how many people are really treated? And that is the biggest thing. And the difference is the access to healthcare. So despite the fact that we can call a borderless world, it's very complicated still to provide therapy that is uniform across the globe for many reasons, one of them being significant barriers, regulatory barriers across the globe. Very difficult today to have a clinical trial that can be adopted across the globe. So that costs a significant amount of money, multiple times more than you would if you just had a globally accepted. And there is something that if there was something to be done in global health would be unification of clinical trials that can take therapies and drugs and devices across the world. And because the markets can regulate price, markets can regulate cost. What the markets are not regulating well today is the adoption of the technology because the lack of understanding how the patient should be treated more effectively in several different countries.
So I love this idea of having a common standard across various jurisdictions so that you didn't have to go and apply for marketing approval in 17 different jurisdictions or have clinical trials follow X number of rules. But another fundamental challenge is, of course, the supply chain. And when you're dealing with global companies today, particularly in something like Cardinal Health, where you have an extraordinarily global supply chain, and talk a little bit about the challenges there.
Yeah, so I mean, the conversation earlier has been about the commercial borderlessness or the absence of that. I think on the supply chain side, it is quite seamless. I shouldn't say seamless, it is quite global. It's not always seamless. It is virtually, even if you think of yourself as a domestic company in healthcare, it is very likely that you're dependent on intermediates or other products that are coming from around the world, whether or not it's active pharmaceutical ingredient for the pharmaceutical supply chain, dosage forms. A company like ours, we produce radioisotopes, or we compound radioisotopes that are used in imaging for cancer or cardiology. Those nuclear isotopes are not being produced in the US. They're being produced in the Netherlands and in South Africa and in Canada. Clinical apparel, safety apparel, is being sewn in parts of Asia. That work is not being done here in the US. And so I think even if you have commercially a business that is focused on the domestic US market, it is very likely that you're part of this global interconnected network.
Cliff, one of the things that was raised by Joe, excuse me, is we talk about global disease, pandemics, etc. One of the greatest things that's affecting the world today is the export from the United States of our food, fast food, etc., around the world. So when you look at obesity, that's costing the US over $1.5 trillion a year just in chronic disease. We've now exported that, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Asia, parts even of Europe. And so we are exporting this enormous burden to deal with in the rest of the world. For example, if you went to medical school in China 3 decades ago, you never studied obesity and you didn't study diabetes. They are on the verge of having the most people that have diabetes in the world today. And incidence of hormone-driven cancers have doubled, tripled, and quadrupled in some cities. So it just isn't the movie that we're worried about something that started in Africa that traveled around the world. The changing of the food chain around the world has dramatically changed the onset of diseases, particularly chronic diseases.
So how do we change the conversation about healthcare so that we're thinking of it as a global conversation? Since clearly it is, I mean, it's touching every part of the business, of the regulatory process, the innovation cycle. How do we start thinking about that? Because we Americans tend to be very focused on the US.
Let me give an example. We're working with the Indonesian government. Indonesia, as most people know, has 150 to 180 million people. Islands everywhere, very disconnected population in terms of how you connect between the islands, and healthcare service is very complex. So the ability to bring people with kidney injury or chronic kidney disease is very difficult. So we're working with the government. We took them to Colombia. We run one of the most successful global pre-dialysis treatment and dialysis treatment in Colombia. Baxter has its own clinics there. We're the market leader there, and we have phenomenal success. Why? Because you can start from scratch, and we can produce and sell products from folks. If they learn and standardize the protocols, you can get much better at treating dialysis patients before they actually need the dialysis, not only saving a significant amount of funds, but also preserving the lifestyle of the patient, who can work and can do other things before going into a more invasive treatment, which they have to do either in a clinic for 3 times a week, 4 hours a day, or do it at home with peritoneal dialysis. So it is important that governments understand that there are other places that they can learn, and protocols are not explored on a global basis the same way. So treatment protocols that work in several places have significant resistance, either by the medical community sometimes, or by governments in terms of adoption. So our ability to have the opportunity to show the Indonesian government and partner with them in how we're going to develop the dialysis treatment for untreated patients in Indonesia was a big deal. So there's more to be done. It's incumbent upon the companies, incumbent upon the governments to come together in a partnership to treat those very critical diseases.
I think to expand on this, if you think about my personal view, we will become a more evidence-based healthcare system. The evidence is global. We see it from around the world. So I'm sure that a lot of this meetings, discussions will be about the pure science of that. But there's other aspects to this. So for example, we have dramatically aging populations around the world. There are really varying degrees in terms of how effectively our aging populations are, what their welfare is like, whether or not they're happy, isolated, many different aspects. This is now being measured in different countries in different ways. So we have a lot to learn, and it's not just in the basic sciences, it's in the delivery of care. How do we think about wellness? How do we treat the aging population? The kinds of things that Mark talked a little bit about earlier. So social determinants are very important, and we can study other countries, and there are things we can learn.
Yeah, I'd love to get a question here, a comment. Yeah, do we have anybody over here? Okay, well, while you're thinking about, oh, we've got one right there. Please let yourself.
Thank you, Cliff. Alberto Grignolo, par excel. I'm puzzled by the comment or suggestion that global clinical trials are a barrier, that somehow it's not possible to do them. I say that because we do dozens of them. And in fact, the regulatory barriers to doing clinical trials are collapsing everywhere. China, even 4 months ago, said they'll be happy to accept foreign data as part of global trials in which Chinese patients would also be included, and they want to see those. But Japan, US, Europe are all welcoming global trials as a way to accelerate the arrival of medicines to patients that need them. So I just wanted to make the point that A, I was puzzled, and B, there's evidence that pharma and CROs are conducting global trials all the time with relatively few regulatory barriers. So the days of blaming regulators are kind of waning, and we can blame other people now, but the regulators are no longer a chokeable neck.
I think
I don't think you're 100% there. It happens multiple times, but the data set is highly scrutinized, and the cost sometimes is prohibitive. You can do that, and we do that. We have 1,000 patients going on a new dialysis treatment for a new filter that we have, but the trial it took a while to design because to satisfy different countries. So you can do it, but it's still quite a bit of barrier, not for them to accept, but also to get paid on that therapy. So you have both the reimbursement issue, which is easily, people don't look at that as much as you look at the clinical trial, but the regulatory in general is until recently, you can approve things in Europe in a very less bureaucratic way. It's changing, unfortunately. But to get paid in Germany and other countries in Europe is more difficult. So I agree with you on the regulatory clinical trials. In regulatory in general becomes still a barrier. It would be easier if those collapsed even further. It's getting progress, but it's still quite a bit of work.
I'd like to just point out, if you look at what's occurred in India, where they've now effectively registered and identified 1.3 billion people. In much of their treatment, if we took cancer, people with advanced cancer, in many cases, don't get any treatment. Because you're going to figure out you have more people to deal with than you can afford treatment. this will open up significant treatment, and the ability to register a person for a clinical trial might take a day to get the number of people rather than a year. And so I think we sometimes forget this is a challenge in China. Many of the people with serious diseases, there is no Medicaid, Medi-Cal, other devices. They cannot even afford treatment. So those willing to participate in clinical trials in many ways is their only hope. And I think the sheer fact that 40% of the people in the world live in India and China holds great promise for much of this work.
Is there any country that's doing it right? You know, we talk a lot about the challenges in healthcare in the U.S. Is there a country that you think, you know, ought to be a model for us?
Cliff, before we pick on the United States, I just want to stress the work that we've done over the last 25 years. If people weighed the same in the United States as they did in the start of the 1990s, you wouldn't even be having these conversations. So what we've done here is we've added this enormous burden due to lifestyle from chronic diseases due to the change in weight. There was only 4 states in the United States in the early 90s that had any obesity problems: Louisiana, Mississippi, West Virginia, and Michigan. Today, all states do. So you can't really compare the U.S. because we are the heaviest, most obese country in the world. And so I think part of the discussion you've had here is if we could engage earlier, if we could reduce obesity, you might have a dramatic change in what's going on here.
I think the question also as to where it's done right means in what context. So you could very easily argue that if you were anywhere in the world today and you got very sick, where would you want to be? And the answer is right here in the United States. You could also argue that we have a problem with equity in the United States in terms of healthcare. So it's not about our capacity to deliver the finest healthcare on earth right here in the United States. It is about whether or not it's available and accessible to everyone. There are other aspects of health, and I think this is where you get the connection between, you know, do we spend so much in healthcare because we're not spending it in other aspects of life that might affect our wellness. So I think this is going to be one of those vexing problems, and it also ties to the question of culture, which is what we might accept as someone in Canada or Denmark might accept as a delay waiting for a particular procedure. An American might be completely frustrated.
It's a great point. I'd love to get another question from somewhere in the audience. Anybody? Oh, yeah, we got one right there. While we're waiting, if you identify yourself, please.
Hi, Jennifer Miller from Bioethics International and NYU School of Medicine. Do you think globalization is a double-edged sword in clinical trials? So positive things, we get to know how, in theory, different drugs work for different populations and they get access to clinical trials. And we know that patients in clinical trials fare better than those that aren't in trials in the US and globally. But on the other end, do you worry about the generalizability of the data produced through globalizing trials? I ask this because when I think about the drugs that were approved in 2012, I think just those sponsored by large companies, they were conducted in a median of 2,000 people in like 40 different countries. So how generalizable is the data from clinical trials as we continue to globalize?
Sometimes you hear that ethnicity play a role, so it depends upon the drug. But in some of the products that we design, we're a medical device and a little bit of pharmaceutical, injectable pharmaceutical company. I think a global trial is we're just doing one right now for the proving of a certain filtration of molecules into a dialyzer. 1,000 people, and if you select, you get a good CRO, you're going to end up with a good data, and the statistics are proven to be there. So it's tough to judge from the the comment that some of these drugs are 2,000 people. Some you do post-clinical trial studies, and you continue to validate the data for different indications. So I think it's okay to have this approved and done correctly, and I think there is merit for the numbers that they are chosen. You have, Cliff, you had mentioned something about what country is doing right. There's a huge progress that we've been making as an industry with the FDA. I think the FDA has moved significantly in a way that understands how difficult was in the past. I think that in the United States, we have the advantage of having a more open FDA today that perhaps we had in the past, and it has made a huge difference. Some groups of countries in the world are going the other way. So it's tough to see that. And U.S. has more of a consistent approach to how an approval is managed. Sometimes is less expected outcomes from other countries. So I would say I'll give Dr. Gottlieb and the new administration, the FDA, some credit, and the previous one as well, for having moved the FDA to a different level and being more aligned to the interests of the patients in the country.
Yeah, I think that's where I'd love to spend, we have a couple of minutes left on emerging
Just like to
threats.
comment, if I could, one
Yeah,
second
please.
on that last question,
Yeah.
Cliff. One, we don't know by taking tests all over the world whether people have the same microbiome. So we don't know necessarily how people adjusted because they might be substantially different from one another, not necessarily in DNA, but in their microbiome or other issues. So that's one challenge. But I think one of the things I would say about these clinical trials around the world, if you step back and look at China, what could be a challenge to the rule of the current president of China? Not dealing with medical problems. They have far more than anyone else. The environmental that's occurred, you have to solve this issue. Great companies like Cardinal and Baxter and others ultimately will have great opportunities in China because you're serving the people. The same thing in India. So you're going to see dramatic changes and also the change in the cost curve of how you're going to deliver them. But there is no future for many of these government leaders, no matter how important they are today, if they can't solve the healthcare problems in their own country.
Yeah. The last question is emerging threats. You know, what we saw with the response to Ebola, the WHO was criticized. Part of the challenge was it's difficult to get information on the ground. There are delays in relaying this. They're not as sophisticated in terms of the public health response in some cases. We have, a vulnerability in the sense that these emerging threats don't stay in those localities. How can we as a society work together to stop some of those? Anybody want to take on that?
Boy.
I'd say, biological warfare. We can forget just the spread of
To engage in biological, that's what you want to do?
Well, I'm saying that is the risk that you can see. It's always been available. You had an ethical system that was in place after World War II. We can question whether that system is still in place today. And so one of the keys to this whole area is understanding biologics and what the access or potential antidotes are to them, whether it's Ebola or whether it's an attack that's planned. So those are both of them. But I would say to you right now, the #1 disease being spread through the world is obesity and the side effects on that, Cliff.
That is a tweet right there.
So you have a great opportunity to create data analytics that can collect data on the ground a little faster and be able to deploy faster, more economical solutions than just deploying through non-for-profit and charitable organizations. Today do most of the work.
Thank you very much, Joe, George, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you.
Thank you.